Welcome back, students. Today we're going to talk about reflecting functions. So we have two types of reflections. We have, if you're going to reflect across the x-axis, that means that it's going to flip upside down. So everything that's above the x-axis is now going to be below, and everything that was below the x-axis is now going to be above. When that happens, you are going to have a negative right here on the outside of your function. So if it is on the outside, it reflects over the x-axis. I also want you to think of this as if it's on the outside of the function, it negates the y values. So all that means is that if you had a positive y value, negating it would make it negative. And if you had a negative y value, negating it makes it positive. Okay? The next thing that you have is reflecting across the y-axis. If it is reflecting across the y-axis, that's flipping side to side. So that means whatever's on the left side is going to move to the right side. Whatever's on the right side moves to the left side. And you'll notice that the negative is going to be on the inside of the function. So it's either going to be in the parentheses or in the absolute value sign or in the exponent when you're dealing with exponential. It is on the inside of the function. It is with your x. And that is going to negate the x values. So I just think of it this way. If it's inside with my x, then that means that my x values are going to be the opposite. If it is on the outside of my function, then it is going to change my y values to the opposite. Okay, before we work some examples, I want to remind you that before you complete a horizontal translation, the coefficient on the x, whoops, let me get my pen again, the coefficient on the x must be equal to 1. Therefore, if you have a negative x, you're going to have to factor out that negative because the coefficient has to be 1. It can't be negative 1. And we'll show you some examples here in a few minutes. Okay, so let's work some examples. I'm going to move this up. And in the first example, the directions are they want us to write the parent function, they want us to list the changes with regard to the parent, and then they want us to graph it. Okay, so I'm going to do this like I did on the previous lesson. The first thing you need to recognize is what the parent function is. Well, a key on this one is that it is raised to the third power, and so therefore this is the cubic function. And I want you to also write down what the equation for the parent function is, which was x to the third. So basically everything that's in this equation right here that is not like this equation, that is making something happen to the graph. It's either moving it up, down, left, right, or reflecting it. And then pretty soon we'll be talking about stretching and shrinking. But right now we've just talked about translating left and right, translating up and down, and reflecting it. Okay, so let's see what's going to happen to this one. So I'm going to start by just making my table. Well, actually, let's write down what's going to happen. So if you look at the +2 on the outside, so let's go ahead and underline everything that is affecting our y. So everything that's on the outside of the function is the +2 and then this negative sign. Okay? Well, you need to keep in mind that the negative sign, because it is on the outside, it's going to negate the y values, which is going to make it reflect over the x-axis. So I'm going to write that down. It's going to reflect over the x-axis. And it's very important that you tell me which way it's reflecting. And then the +2 is going to make it move up. Okay, so I'm going to say that it's going to move up 2. And then on the inside of my function, I have this minus 1. Notice that my x does have a coefficient of 1, so I'm good there. But I want to go ahead and say what this minus 1 is making me do. And if you remember, it's going to move left or right, and it's always the opposite of common sense. So minus 1 is actually going to move to the right 1. Okay, now we need to graph the function. So to do that, let's start with our original table. So we're going to make our t-chart. So our original key points of the cubic is -2, -8, -1, -1, 0, 0, 1, 1, and 2, 8. And if you don't have that memorized, you can take out your pink notes because the table is there of the key points. So let's use these key points to figure out where our new points are going to be. So if I reflect it over the x-axis, remember you always want to do your reflections first before you start translating. If I'm reflecting it over the x-axis, that is negating my y values, and so that's going to affect my y value here. So I'm going to put negative y, but then it's also going to move up too, so I'm going to do negative y, and then I'm going to add 2 to it. And so everything that I have written in red is affecting the y value. So let's go ahead and do that. If I take negative y, that's going to be negative -8, which is positive 8, and positive 8 plus 2 is 10. A negative -1 would be positive 1, and positive 1 plus 2 is 3. 0, negate the 0, well, it's going to stay 0, plus 2 is 2. And then 1, take the -1, that's -1, plus 2 is 1. And then 8, so negate your 8, so -8 plus 2 gives you -6. Okay, now let's do what's affecting my x value. Well, the only thing that's affecting my x value is this plus 1 in here, or I'm sorry, minus 1, which is going to make it move to the right 1. So that's going to take our x value and add 1 to it to move it to the right. So let's figure out what that is. If I take -2 and I add 1 to it, that gives me -1. -1 plus 1, it gives me 0. 0 plus 1 gives me 1. 1 plus 1, 2. 2 plus 1, 3. So this gives me my new values. So I'm going to try and graph that on my graph. Let's go ahead and zoom in on this a little bit so I can see the graph better. Whoops. Okay, let's go ahead and graph it. So -1, 10, -1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is up here. It's at the very top. And then I've got 0, 3, which would be right here. And then I have 1, 2. And then I have 2, 1. And I have 3, -6. Which is right here. Okay, and if you remember what your cubic function looks like, it's going to curve down here and then start to curve up on the left. Okay, so there's our graph. Okay, moving on to number 2, I'm going to go a little bit faster on this one. This is our absolute value function. So if I'm going too fast, just please pause it and rewind it. In fact, if you want to go ahead and pause it now and work through this and then start it up again to see how you did. Okay, what's on the outside is the negative and then the plus 1. So that's going to reflect over the x-axis and move it up 1. And then what's on the inside is the plus 2. That's opposite of common sense, so it's going to move to the left. Oops, the left 2. Alright, so now let's go ahead and make our t-chart with our absolute value table, and then we'll go ahead and see how it affects our x and our y. So for our absolute value, we have -2, +2, -1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2. But now let's see how this affects our graph. So it's reflecting over the x-axis, so that's going to negate our y and move up 1, so that's +1. So if I go through here and do that, let's do that real quick. -2 + 1 is -1. -1 + 1 would be 0. A 0 + 1 is 1. -1 + 1 is 0. And then -2 + 1 would be -1. Okay, now on my x, I'm going to move it to the left 2, which is going to take my x values and -2. So -2 - 2 would be -4. -1 - 2, -3, 0 - 2, -2, 1 - 2 would be -1, 2 - 2 would be 0. And now let's go ahead and graph our graph. So we've got -4, -1 is our first point. So 1, 2, 3, 4, -1 would be down here. And then -3, 0. And then we'd have -2, 1, and -1, 0, and 0, -1. If you remember, the absolute value is a V. Since it did get reflected, then it's going to be an upside down V. And there we go. Okay, moving on to example 3. I'm going to do example 3, and then I'm going to let you do number 4 on your own and see if you get that right. So in example 3, there's one thing that I'm going to notice. Do you see how this negative is with the x? And that means that the coefficient of x is not 1, it's -1. So the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to factor out that negative underneath the cube root. So I'm going to write that here. All you're going to do is you're going to put the negative on the outside and you're pulling it out. So the x is just going to be x. But then if I take -1 and I divide out that negative, it's now going to make it a +1. It's very important that you do this before you start, because if you don't, then you're going to be writing down that it is moving in the wrong direction. That coefficient of x has to be 1 before you can start. Okay, so it is a cube root function, and the equation for that is y equals the cube root of x. And let's write down what's happening. So on the outside of my parent function, it's actually just moving up 2. And on the inside of my parent function, I have this negative, and that's going to negate my x values. So it's going to reflect over the y-axis. And because I have the +1, it's the opposite of common sense, so it's going to move to the left 1. All right, now when we do this, we always have to start with our reflections. Okay, so we're going to have to reflect it over the y-axis and then move it left 1 and then move it up 2. So let's go ahead and draw our t-chart for cube root. So if you need to grab your pink notes, go ahead and pause the video to get them out and fill in your table. Okay, so here is your table for your cube root function. So let's go ahead and figure out what is going on with this. So reflect over the y-axis. That is going to be, it's going to negate your x values. So I'm going to negate my x values, and then move left 1 is going to make it move -1. So let's go ahead and do that first. So negate the -8 makes it +8, and 8 minus 1 is 7. Negate the -1, which makes it 1, and 1 minus 1 is 0. Negative 0 is just 0, and 0 minus 1 is -1. Negate the 1, make it -1. -1 minus 1 is -2. And then negate the 8, that makes it -8. -8 minus 1 is -9. Okay? And on the y value, it is just going to move it up 2. So we just have to add 2 to all of these. So we get 0, we get 1, we get 2, we get 3, and we get 4. Okay, so let's go ahead and graph our new points. We've got 7, 0. So that's going to be just right here. And then we've got 0, 1. Okay. Then we have -1, 2. Okay. And then we have -2, 3. And then we have -9, 4. So that's going to be right here. Okay, and if you kind of remember what the cube root function looks like, I'm just going to draw the dotted line of what, let's see, let me get a different color, a dotted line of what it usually looks like. It usually looks like something like this. Of course, I'm just drawing a sketch, so it looks really bad, but so just let's just double check it. Did it reflect over the y-axis? Okay. Well, all of these are going to go over here, so it looks like it did. This one's going to go over here, because it's going to reflect over the y-axis. Looks like it did, and then it also is going to move to the left one, which you can see that your origin moved to the left one and up 2. So this is your new origin right there, and now we should be able to go ahead and fill in what the graph is going to kind of look like. So it's going to curve down here, and it's going to curve up here. So you can kind of check yourself after you draw it. I know that's a terrible drawing, but it is kind of hard to draw on this iPad. Okay, so that's number 3. Hopefully you got that right and you're understanding how to set this up. So I want you to try to do number 4 on your own. Okay, here is what you should have gotten for number 4. Please check your answer and make sure that you've got everything correct, and then you may move on to the next slide. Okay, these last few problems are a little less time consuming, but you are going to have to write down an equation. So let me show you how I do this. When it says write the quadratic parent function, I stop there and I go ahead and just write down above that what my quadratic parent function looks like as an equation, which is y equals x squared. Okay, now it's going to tell me that it is reflected over the x-axis. So I also want you to think of what that looks like. When it gets reflected over the x-axis, it takes something up here and moves it down here. So what it's doing is it's negating the y values. If it's affecting your y values, then it is going to be a negative on the outside. So that's what I'm going to write down. And this is just little notes to myself so that I can write my equation quicker. If it's going to shift right 8, I want you to think about either right or left always goes on the inside with my x, and if I'm moving to the right it's the opposite, so I'm going to put a -8. And then the other thing, the +5 is going to get added to the end here, and it's going to be a +5. So right here you kind of have what your equation is going to look like, and the only thing that you need to add to that is that negative on the outside. So here is your finished equation. Y equals negative is on the outside. I've got x minus 8 squared and then plus 5. And I always double check it and just kind of read through the problem again to make sure that it's correct. Okay, do number 6 on your own, and I'm going to have you fill that out on the whisk. Okay, I hope this lesson was helpful. This is a very difficult topic, so please make sure that you're understanding and ask any questions that you need to ask on this whisk so that I can go over the confusions the next day. Thank you.